Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome again to another episode on Talk Architecture Podcast, and I'm your host, Naziaty Muhammad Yaacob. Now, I have been reading about Christopher Alexander notes on the synthesis of form and the way that he put out an argument for design, which is to do with logic. And much of his work done, his many books such as Pattern Language and The Timeless Way of Building, it is based on some, one would say, common sense in designing architecture. We have that group of people, that group of thinkers, which is opposite to what Donald A. Norman does on emotional design and the design of everyday things, which one would consume or would buy a design based on they like the design, they like how it looks. Now, there's one way of framing this argument regarding form versus content, which is something that we had debated for ages that I could recall. But I would like to focus on how do we teach architecture design. I would like to focus on the approach that we had been doing all this while and that was taught to us and which is easy to teach us this way, which is the formalistic way or formalism. Now, today's discussion is about formalism and the opposite to formalism, which is non-formalist way of teaching or practicing architecture, or the alternative approaches in architecture. Now, I would like to do a two-part series, and this first part is trying to come up with some arguments with regard to formalism versus non-formalism approach to architecture. Well, we know that architecture is often approached in a formalistic manner with heavy emphasis on form, geometry, composition, and aesthetics. And here aesthetics is a very loose term, and I wish I would break down to using motifs, ornamentation, embellishment, facade design, how you would dress up the skin of a building. I would put it loosely like that. But the argument is aesthetics also include the experience in three-dimension or four-dimension, or the going through a space, you can actually encompass some sense of aesthetics. But of course, there are other words that could explain it better. But I'm going to put it this way first about formalistic manner. This focus serves as a foundational method for teaching design. I've been taught this way, and I could assume that a lot of people were taught this way, except for some schools of thoughts. So this is a basic way to teach studio, establishing architectural autonomy. What is architectural autonomy? So, this is what differ from teaching other discipline or other subjects, such as design engineering or other design disciplines. And we need to manage the complexity of creative projects as well. So architecture is different than all the other arts and crafts, fine art, graphic arts, sculpture. Well, in a way, I've mentioned that architecture is a sculpture, deemed to be looking like a sculpture and work as a sculpture, but it needs to be functional as well. So there is a complexity in this particular creative project. So But this reveals little about the deeper reasons behind this predominance of formalistic approach in architecture. So the formalistic approach has long been criticized for neglecting functionality and context, yet it remains deeply rooted in the history of art theory, providing students with a precise language to understand, analyze, and create built forms. The question arises why even in the last century, 20th century, and particularly in our current era, do we continue to question this formalistic dominance? Why question at all? It's just the way people want to build architecture, they have the money, and they want a certain look. So that is, in a way, formalistic, right? So in the 1980s, we recall that building on earlier functionalist ideas from the 1930s through the 1950s, where functionalism itself often manifested as a formal way of designing, architects began challenging certain typologies. New institutional types emerge, such as orphanage, elderly or senior homes, and residences for unwed mothers. So this social architecture emerged, yeah? It is to do with the Dutch structuralist school in particular, question purely functional aspects, such as Herman Herzberger, for instance. His contemporaries, of course, Aldo van Eyck and others in the group of Team 10 as well. So Herzberger emphasized a building is a shell or framework, a form and a structure, while living spaces open for occupants or end users to personalize and complete through their own interventions and adaptations. Actually, other architects do that as well. I recall Jean Nouvel's housing. So people pick up on this. But here we have the first conscious effort to look at the program or to look at the functional aspects as the main a catalyst or the one that starts the design and how you generate form from inside out. So this raises a broader issue. Why do we design formalistically from the outside? If the goal is merely to equip students with a language for understanding, analyzing, and creating built forms, and if this approach persists in professional practice, where presentations to clients often begin with the building's external appearance, then why is this neglect of other dimensions permitted so unconditionally, as if it were the only valid way to perceive architecture? Well, you could argue with this questioning, this line of questioning, but I wish to go and put it that way to sort of push it further, this idea, this notion that people value the forms more than the function or how it works well or not. So you would think that today, in this day and age, because of sustainable design and sustainability, one would need to actually take care of the functional aspects of building. But the whole thing is mixed together, or the whole thing is interlinked in a way that architecture education, as well as architecture practice, and the way we approach how to educate future architects is really crucial in actually to form the survival of this profession. Some people don't really like the way that this is being said, but it's necessary to look at it this way, in a way that one could actually see the tensions. So several reasons explain the persistence of formalistic education in architecture. First, so these are the ones that we found out from research. Firstly, formalism offers a structured visual and analytical method for addressing design problems. It prioritizes how a building is structured over why it exists. enabling students to deconstruct complex buildings into manageable geometric components. It's like a bit of Legoland there. I mean, a bit of, zoning, shall we say. This is when planning becomes much more to do with zoning rather than to do with experience of the spaces and how one would. You look at Francis D.K. Ching book, and there are many ways to plan it, right? Circular or radial or using a wing, and stuff like that. So, yeah, formalism. It's about formalism, how we actually look at it that way. Now, the second one, it establishes disciplinary autonomy. We're talking about architectural autonomy, defining architecture as a unique, independent discipline, distinct from mere technical, social, or functional service, rather than subordinating it to other fields. You'd want the architect to be the only person that could, in the team of consultants in the construction industry, to be able to be dealing with form making. The others will not be able to do that. If you were to say that form making is secondary, then the autonomy is not there, because other people say, okay, we'll just put things together and we generate a design and we just cover it with skin that is orientate to the orientation of the sun and the wind patterns, and then presto, we have a building. And that is what's happening anyway. That is what is happening, but the client wants to see the form. How did you come up with that form? A signature designed by the architect, or embellish it like in a blob, or a form that is suited to what the architect is marketing the design like. So this also reinforces the third point. Formalism treats architecture as an art form, fostering aesthetic expression and creativity. Excuse me. In the early stages of design, it encourages the development of bold ideas and a strong aesthetic vision, which are essential for creating compelling spaces rather than constraining students with technical or logical limits from the start. Okay, you just have a plasticine and try to create a blob and try to compose out of it. But actually, why not design from inwardly, how you want to make it smell, taste, feel? I mean, that's more phenomenological, which is different than formalistic. But here, the third point is very particular to what we discussed earlier about is architecture art and art architecture. That sort of, is architecture science and art, and which is more? Is it an artist with a science background or a scientist with an art background? We came up to the reasoning that a scientist with an art background. So, but really the debate here is that formalistic design approach, is it relevant now? Is it something that is only the jurisdiction of architects? And you say yes, yes, and yes. If not, you don't have the discipline. If you're not going to design in a formalistic way. Fourth is, there's a fourth point here. It draws from a deep historical and theoretical tradition. Modern architectural education remains heavily influenced by the artistic formalism movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which prioritize pure, visible form as a core element of aesthetics and criticism. This legacy persisted in schools, evident in the modernist sensibilities thought through the use of concrete, slim lines, and balanced horizontal and vertical volumes, principles that were still emphasized even in the 1980s and even until now. And the fourth point is Fifth, architectural training relies heavily on visual techniques in the studio setting. The dependence on diagrams, models, and other representations often promotes a focus on visual and aesthetic qualities over the other crucial factors. The fifth point is a bit dodgy. I mean, in a way that it is a presumption about architectural training that heavily use on visual techniques. And then it lays down the use of diagrams, models, and other representation. In the work of Christopher Alexander in the Notes on the Synthesis of Form, the diagrams are something that strengthen about the design problem and every little particular design problems that is challenged when you do an architecture project. And yes, we can admire those these diagrams, bubble diagrams, site analysis diagrams, models. We can admire them, but they are actually summaries of research. And there are schools that rely on these summaries to start a design, and the rest will be merely trying to get it right until the end. The vision that one sets out to do in the beginning will materialize when one starts putting decisions on the construction methods, on the structure, on the M&E, on that philosophical, theoretical ideas that one has about how an architecture should look like. But for students of architecture, it is crucial that this whole process is being done really. And yes, we do use visual techniques in the studio setting, and we depend on all these diagrams, models, and other representations, but they are summaries of thoughts, and they're not an end by itself, but a means to keep on doing the process of design, architectural design. So I'm going to round up this points in the first part of our discussion on formalism and alternative approaches in architecture. We have gone through the points with regard to why formalistic way. So critiques of formalism highlight its limitation and propose alternative perspectives. A purely formal approach can neglect a building's function, social impact, and environmental context. Historically, even periods like the Renaissance and the Baroque considered the user, somebody who they want them to be embracing the religion, particularly in churches, using form to evoke drama, heighten emotion, and spiritual redemption. But later on, circular buildings, including schools, such as the school in Glasgow by Alexander Hamilton, adopted classical elements more superficially, often as a dressing up of the facade rather than an integrated whole. We do find a lot of colonial architecture influenced schools established before independence in 1957, or missionary schools that have some classical elements in the architecture. Another criticism is the gap between academic emphasis on artistic or paper architecture and the practical demands of professional practice, which require technical skills, budgeting, and management. While manual design once began with formal massing, contemporary workflows often involve schematics followed by embellishment. This is back to digital architecture and the use of digital tools in architecture. We would come up with the square meters or the area and schematic design, and then we embellish it by form. We can play with the form by looking at different ways of massing, and that is done through certain digital tools. And AI now is great, isn't it, and to do this. And then really, when you buy that, when the client buys that sort of how it looks like from a, external perspective, then you try to work inside out. Because of budget and time constraints, you come up with that way of designing. So in a way, it is formalistic. It is to do with the form, making first. So there is this gap. And how we teach architecture students to actually be ready and prepared, but for what? So this is when we have this conversation. And later in different episodes, especially the one with a conclusion to the interviews that we will be, an interview that we'll be doing with Kevin Matlow, we shall go into that. Contemporary discourse increasingly moves beyond strict formalism towards contextualism, sustainability, and social responsibility. Yet, sustainability efforts frequently amount to superficial additions like terraces or rooftop gardens, while energy-intensive features such as air conditioning persist, representing embellishment rather than the true paradigm shift. Social responsibility demands attention to the building's purpose and end users, and yet much speculative development prioritizes corporate signatures or trendy acceptability over genuine occupant needs. Post-occupancy evaluations remain rare, limiting learning from real use. Ultimately, the prevalence of formalistic design stems from both long-standing educational traditions and entrenched professional practices. Geometry and proportion continue to underpin good design, ensuring alignment, coherence, and aesthetic integrity in many respected firms. However, true advancement may require integrating sensorial and experiential dimensions, phenomenological approaches that prioritize how spaces feel, smell, sound, and engage all senses alongside contextual fit, where form emerges organically from the site and uses rather than being imposed from the beginning. This formalistic tendency, while providing valuable tools, risks reducing architecture to surface aesthetics unless balanced with deeper consideration of human experience and purpose. So I want to talk about the two approaches in the next episode, which is Phenomenology and Dutch Structuralism, comparing that to formalism or formalistic approach. These two, Phenomenology and Dutch Structuralism, which are philosophies that do not start with form making but other aspects of design, we know there's a lot that had been written and referenced already. However, at the end of the day, I would like to say what I wanted to say earlier about logical versus the emotional approach to design, because somehow that has to do with all of this. Is it the ingredient that binds it together, the argument that sort of, conclude nicely everything? Or are we still stuck in the architectural theory aspects of which is better approach, formalistic or non-formalistic? Those people, even the ones who are in phenomenology, they're conscious about aesthetics like Peter Zumthor, Stephen Hall, and Tadao Ando, obviously, and how the forms would shape the experiences. We could see sensorial or multisensorial sensibilities in their design. But yet again, we're also looking at it in terms of architecture education and things that happen in the Dutch structuralist work, such as Herman Husberger and Aldo van Eyck, where they have a lot of in-between spaces being designed. And this resonated with Kishio Kurokawa, actually, and the Asian tradition in architectural design, where traditional concepts such as the in-between spaces, may it be the 5-foot way, or I forgot the name for Japanese architecture, but these things occur as well between public and private realm, and they could be interpreted and included as something that is part of it's not accidental, it's intentionally done for certain types of buildings and typologies, especially like housing, because there is a cultural significance to these buildings or these spaces. So it's about how the architect or the architectural designer wish to adopt the approach and how they could convince the client at the end of the day. We are also making assumptions that architectural designer approaches with critical thought processes rather than commercially driven agendas. So, as to focus on the right way to teach architecture. I do not want to divorce practice from education here, and that's very much the whole thing is a guide in a way how to teach students of architecture so that they could be more critical rather than commercial. I mean, the commercial is, shall we say, a default, or that the student could survive in a commercially driven agenda, working in a commercially driven practice. And you don't have to justify it because we know that you need to survive as an architect in this day and age. So, anyway, with this in mind, we come to the end of this episode. We ask the very fundamental question, very relevant to education and practice. Should we start design from form and then try to make it habitable and meaningful? Or should we start from experience, place, body, program, situation, and let form grow from that? It may be as simple as that, but in analyzing people's work, we can see what are the elements that shows the architect is doing number one or number two, formalistic or the non-formalistic way. So that's in general, yeah? So this remains one of the deepest ongoing debates in architecture, form versus function, even from Louis Sullivan days. So the question is, what is your own instinct on this tension? Do you feel more pulled towards one side, or do you believe they must always be pursued together? And who has managed to do that? And we all have our say and our piece on that. So thank you very much for listening to the first part of Formalism and Alternative Approaches in Architecture, Part 1.